Have you ever seen a luxurious black sedan break down on a dusty rural road, only to be rescued by an old pickup truck that's held together by grit and history? This is exactly where our story begins. Two people from entirely different worlds, connected by fate and a faulty engine. In our tale, the farmer's battered truck symbolizes decades of family legacy, while the stranded traveler carries secrets powerful enough to change his future. You won't believe how one simple act of kindness unravels years of hidden motives and sparks a romance nobody saw coming. To find out how their journey twists and turns, and to see whether they can overcome the obstacles of corporate boardrooms, struggling farmland, and the weight of family expectations. Be sure to stay tuned for the full story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and follow us for more inspiring tales. Your support helps us continue bringing you the best stories around. Walter Grayson was 63 years old and had lived on the same patch of land his entire life. His great-grandfather had come west with nothing but a horse and a dream, eventually homesteading this farm on the gentle slopes outside the small town of Maplefield. For 4 generations, the Graysons tended cattle, grew corn, and most importantly, passed down the values of resilience and hard work. Walter had been an only child. He grew up trailing after his father in the fields, learning how to read the sky for storm warnings and fix everything from fences to tractors. As a boy, he prided himself on memorizing every orchard, creek, and hidden path on their 500 acres. By his teens, he could drive any piece of equipment with expert ease. More than once, Walter's father, Joseph, had bragged to the other farmers, "My boy's got grease in his blood. He'll keep this place running longer than any of us." Walter's life followed a predictable rhythm for decades. In his early 20s, he served a brief stint in the army, then returned home to marry his high school sweetheart, Marjorie. They made a life on the farm, the decades slipping by faster than Walter ever anticipated. They had one son, Adam, who eventually moved to California for a corporate job, leaving Maplefield's quiet routine behind. Walter never blamed the boy for seeking opportunities out of state. The farm was tough, and small-scale agriculture had grown even tougher with each passing year. 7 years before our story truly begins, Marjorie lost her long battle with cancer. That winter, the farm felt unbearably quiet, with only the humming of the old heater and the shuffle of Walter's worn boots. In Marjorie's final weeks, she'd asked Walter if he would ever move to be closer to Adam, but he'd simply shaken his head. "I can't leave this place," he told her, his voice thick with grief. "It's in my bones, the same way it was in my father's." He'd stayed true to that promise, living on in the old farmhouse, alone but steadfast. Along with the farmhouse and the land, Walter also inherited his father's prized possession, a 1996 Granite pickup truck. It was battered, scratched, and had over 200,000 miles on it. Yet the engine still purred under Walter's meticulous care. Each ding and patch of rust on the truck's chassis held a story, some dating back to the days when Joseph would take Walter fishing at dawn or pick up feed from the local co-op. Walter kept the truck going long after most people would have traded it in, seeing it as a tangible connection to his lineage. Sometimes, late at night, Walter would open the glove compartment and find old receipts or notes scrawled by his father's hand, and he'd feel closer to him than ever. That summer, the farm's finances were hitting a perilous low. Though Walter was too proud to admit it, the bills were piling up. He tried to fix the aging irrigation system himself, crawling through muddy ditches after rainstorms to patch leaking pipes. Sometimes he skipped meals to save money for spare parts. Each morning he'd pull on his overalls and walk the fields, studying the parched ground, wondering if this would be the year he'd lose the farm for good. Little did he know that his entire life was about to change in one unexpected afternoon on a lonely country road when he would offer a ride to a stranded motorist whose background and destiny were far removed from anything Walter Grayson had ever known. It all began when Walter drove into Maplefield to pick up his tractor's repaired carburetor. The truck's radio had been broken for years, so he often filled the silence by recalling old memories or planning the next day's tasks. On that sweltering afternoon, as he turned onto the narrow county road that led back to his farm, he saw a sleek, black sedan pulled off to the dusty shoulder. A woman in her late 30s, tall, with dark hair pulled into a low bun, stood by the open hood, peering inside with an air of frustration. Walter's first instinct was to keep driving. He had chores to finish, but old Joseph's voice in his head insisted, "You stop and help someone in need, son." So he did. He rolled to a halt a few yards ahead, hopped out, and wiped his brow. "Afternoon." "Car trouble?" he asked, noticing the sweat glistening on her forehead and the slight tremor in her voice as she greeted him. She introduced herself as Eleanor Caldwell, gave a polite but exhausted smile, and explained that her engine had started rattling before dying altogether. Walter could tell at a glance that this was no typical Maplefield visitor. Her clothes, even though practical, were clearly expensive, and her sedan had out-of-state plates that said Caldwell across a decorative license frame. "I can't figure out what happened," she said, stepping aside so he could peer into the engine bay. Walter poked around, checking belts and cables. "Might be something to do with the alternator or battery. Not sure, but I know the town mechanic, Gus, can probably fix it," he replied. "But it's Sunday. I doubt Gus is open." Eleanor's face fell. The sun beat down unrelentingly, and Walter could see the worry etched at the corners of her eyes. He took a moment to size up her predicament. She clearly wasn't from around here, and the next service station was miles away, with no guarantee of a tow truck anytime soon. He made a quick decision. "You can come with me in my old pickup. We'll get you to Maplefield's Inn so you can stay the night. I'll let Gus know first thing in the morning that your car is out here." Eleanor hesitated, glancing at Walter's worn jeans and weathered face, but something in his steady gaze made her trust him. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Walter," he said simply, then motioned for her to follow him. They transferred a small suitcase and a leather satchel from her car into the bed of his truck, shutting the tailgate with a groan of rusted hinges. The ride back was dusty and hot, with the old truck's vents rattling. Eleanor held on to the seat when Walter swerved to avoid potholes, and he apologized for the rough ride, explaining that the county seldom maintained the roads this far out. Despite the sweltering interior, they made small talk. She said she was passing through, researching rural communities. Walter noted how her eyes scanned the passing farmland, as though searching for something beneath the surface. As they approached Maplefield, he felt an odd blend of curiosity and protectiveness. This sophisticated stranger with the broken-down sedan seemed so out of place among the dusty roads and weathered barns. But something about her air of quiet sadness resonated with Walter's own sense of loss. When he finally dropped her at the small Maplefield Inn, a modest building with an old sign that read vacancy, she offered to pay him. He refused, tipping his cap. "Folks around here look out for each other. No charge for simple kindness." She thanked him softly, and for a moment, neither seemed to know what else to say. Walter left without asking further details, convinced he'd likely never see the mysterious Eleanor Caldwell again. That night, Walter tried to go about his usual routine, feeding his 2 remaining cows, patching a leaking irrigation valve near the orchard, but he found his thoughts drifting to the woman and her broken sedan. The memory of her refined manners and the fleeting sadness in her eyes stuck with him like burrs on a wool sweater. He supposed she was just another traveler passing through, but something told him there was more to the story. He caught himself making an excuse. "Maybe I should check on her tomorrow, see if Gus got her car fixed." Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor sat in a cramped room at the Maplefield Inn, tapping away on her tablet. She was indeed researching something to do with rural communities, but not for a casual academic project. Eleanor Caldwell was the youngest child of the late Warren Caldwell, founder of Caldwell Motors, a global automobile giant. Most people recognized Caldwell Motors for its high-end luxury sedans and sports cars. But after her father's passing, Eleanor felt an unsettling hollowness in the direction of the company. Profits were soaring, yet the original spirit, her father's dream of creating reliable vehicles for everyday Americans, seemed lost in the polished world of corporate shareholders. Eleanor's older siblings, who now ran the board, pushed for the next big thing: electric sports cars, automated driving features, and sophisticated technology that catered to the wealthy. Eleanor suspected the company was ignoring the heartland, the very places where her father first tested his earliest prototypes decades ago. She had stumbled upon an old letter written by Warren Caldwell himself, recounting a pivotal trip through the Midwest in 1972. In that letter, he described an encounter with a humble farmer who inspired him to think beyond profit margins and design vehicles that truly serve people in rural communities. That letter never mentioned the farmer's name, but it alluded to a region reminiscent of Maplefield. Restless in her hotel room, Eleanor thought about Walter's battered old truck. Something about it radiated a quiet dignity that reminded her of the stories her father used to tell. She remembered how Warren Caldwell once said, "A vehicle should be a lifetime companion, not a disposable commodity." Over time, Caldwell Motors had drifted from that ideal. Could Maplefield, with its dusty roads and unpretentious residents, hold the key to reigniting her father's original vision? Outside, the neon sign of the inn buzzed, and a single moth fluttered around the porch light. Eleanor closed her tablet and paced the floor. She decided she'd visit Gus's garage first thing in the morning, hopefully repair her car, but also poke around town for insights. The next day, after all, was Monday, a fresh start. And maybe, she told herself, she'd run into that kindly farmer again. He seemed the type who might know every inch of Maplefield, every unspoken story. If she was brave enough, she would ask him more about that battered pickup truck and the local farmland. Before climbing into the stiff inn bed, Eleanor phoned her longtime assistant, Meredith, in Caldwell's Motors' main office. She kept the call short, simply stating that she'd be extending her stay for additional field research. Meredith didn't pry she knew better. Eleanor rarely explained herself to the board or to her siblings. Since her father's death, she'd grown adept at operating under the radar to avoid corporate interference. As she hung up, she recalled the deep lines on Walter's face and the gentle patience in his voice. Despite their age difference, Eleanor was 25 years younger. She sensed a depth and warmth in him that mirrored her father's authenticity. Maybe she was just projecting her own longing, but it felt real enough to hold on to for now. Monday dawned with a sky so brilliant blue it almost hurt the eyes. Walter woke early, as he always did, feeding the cows and checking the orchard. By 7, he was on the road to Gus's garage, partly to drop off a few tractor parts he needed Gus to examine, and partly to see whether the woman's sedan had been towed. The moment he pulled up to the garage, a squat, corrugated metal structure that smelled of oil and dust, he saw Eleanor's black sedan perched on the lift. Gus, a wiry man in his 70s, waved Walter over with a grin. "That car's giving me a run for my money," Gus said, gesturing for Walter to come closer. "Your lady friend is sitting inside, reading a magazine." Walter flushed slightly. "She's not my lady friend, Gus. I just gave her a lift." Gus laughed, his leathery face creasing. "She's a polite one, says she's from some big city, but she sure was asking a lot of questions about farmland, trucks, and mechanics." Walter headed inside to find Eleanor perched on a rickety chair near a vending machine. She smiled softly in greeting. "Good morning, Walter," she said, her tone warm but a bit uncertain. He tipped his cap. "Morning, Caldwell. Gus says your car's stubborn. Might need a day or two to get the part that he needs." Eleanor looked relieved to see him, like a child spotting a familiar face on the first day of school. "Thank you for checking in. I'm just trying to figure out my next step. I can't exactly hitchhike around farmland alone." Walter remembered how quiet Maplefield could be on weekdays. Without a functional car, she'd be stranded at the inn for who knew how long. On the spur of the moment, he offered to drive her around if she needed. Perhaps she wanted to see the local farmland or speak to the county office. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. "I really appreciate it," she said. "I promise I won't take up too much of your time." That day, Walter drove her from one edge of Maplefield to the other, showing her the feed store, the old library, the county records building. At each stop, Eleanor asked an array of questions. Did local farmers still fix their own equipment? How did older trucks hold up on these roads? Were there big agricultural corporations buying land around here? Walter answered as best he could, though he admitted not having exact statistics. Around noon, they shared a simple lunch at Maudie's Diner, the local staple famous for chicken pot pies. Conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Eleanor revealed she was from the East Coast, had been traveling for research, though she didn't detail the Caldwell Motors connection. Walter mentioned losing his wife years ago and the difficulties of making ends meet as a small farmer these days. Despite the gap in age and social standing, a certain bond started to form. Each recognized a sense of longing in the other. Eleanor missed the genuine spirit of her father's ideals, while Walter grieved the absence of a partner and worried about losing his land. By late afternoon, Eleanor was scribbling notes in her leather-bound journal while Walter drove her back to the inn. The sun slanted low, bathing Maplefields fields in gold and orange. Eleanor let out a soft sigh. "This place feels meaningful," she said. "I can't quite explain it, but it reminds me of something my father once wrote." Walter glanced at her curiously but didn't press. Something about the way she said father made him think she carried her own quiet heartache. Dropping her off at the inn, he found himself oddly reluctant to say goodbye. She lingered too, as if searching for a reason to keep talking. But then she just thanked him, her gaze drifting to his old truck, as though she saw more in it than rust and squeaking springs. That evening, Eleanor made a discovery that set her pulse racing. She returned to her hotel room and retrieved a worn folder of documents from her satchel, the letter from her father, along with some old Caldwell Motors archives. She flipped through handwritten notes from decades ago, some referencing rural test sites for the earliest Caldwell pickups. One note mentioned a region near Maplefield, praising the practicality of the local farmers and the importance of understanding their heritage vehicles. The more she read, the more she realized that Maplefield could very well be the place her father wrote about in 1972. Perhaps the unknown farmer who inspired him was still alive, or had descendants who were. Her mind jumped to Walter and his battered granite pickup. He'd mentioned it once or twice, explaining it was his father's before him. Could it be? She recognized she was speculating, yet the coincidence was too strong to ignore. She recalled the line in Warren Caldwell's letter, "A single honest conversation with a farmer can change the way you build vehicles forever." If Walter's father had known her father, or if their families had crossed paths, it would be remarkable, a twist of fate bridging decades. That same night, back at his farmhouse, Walter sat at the small kitchen table under a dim light bulb, trying to balance the checkbook. The numbers weren't good. He was behind on property taxes, and a big corporation had been sniffing around Maplefield, buying failing farms. He worried that he was next. At one point, he got up, rummaged through a drawer, and pulled out an old tin box. Inside were keepsakes, Marjorie's wedding ring, some photos of Adam as a child, and a folded letter from his father, Joseph. Walter unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was shaky near the end of his father's life, but one line stood out. "Never forget that the land and the people around it are more important than any profit. A good vehicle, like a good friend, should last you through storms and sunshine alike." Walter smiled faintly. He remembered Joseph once telling a story about meeting a traveling salesman from a big car company, but that was so many years ago. Could it connect to the Caldwell name? The notion flickered briefly in Walter's mind, but he dismissed it as coincidence. He had more pressing worries than unraveling old family lore. Little did he know that Eleanor was spending her evening piecing together exactly that kind of puzzle. If her father's letter indeed pointed to Maplefield, and if it connected to the Grayson farm, she might have stumbled upon a direct link to the Caldwell Motors legacy, one that could help her pitch a new idea to the board. She wanted to create a line of pickup trucks and SUVs designed for longevity, easy maintenance, and rugged simplicity, bringing Caldwell Motors back to its roots. But she needed proof that this market, this heartland ideology, was alive and well. Eleanor also couldn't deny she felt drawn to Walter for reasons beyond business. There was a poignant sincerity in his gaze, a blend of sorrow and perseverance. Though she was only 38 and had faced corporate battles, her experiences felt shallow compared to his daily struggles to keep a family farm afloat. Lying in bed, she turned off her bedside lamp and stared at the ceiling. She knew the next step would require honesty. She'd have to reveal more about who she really was and what she was doing in Maplefield. She just hoped Walter wouldn't feel betrayed or manipulated. As the next morning rolled around, Gus confirmed that he needed another day to finalize the sedan's repairs. Eleanor seized the chance to talk to Walter again. She found him at the feed store, picking up a small bag of feed he could still afford. Approaching cautiously, she asked if he had time to show her more of Maplefields farmland. "I promise I'll pay you for your gas in time," she offered. Walter almost bristled at the mention of payment. He was old-fashioned and believed in neighborly help without charge, but the memory of last night's bills and property taxes lingered. His pride waged war against his financial reality. "Finally, Rodney," he gave a small nod. "You can pay for lunch if it'll make you feel better," he said, trying to keep an easy tone. "Deal," Eleanor replied, flashing a relieved smile. They drove out beyond Maplefield's modest limits, onto winding gravel roads that cut through wide fields of hay and corn. The old granite truck rattled on the washboard surfaces, and Eleanor clutched the door handle whenever they hit a big rut. Yet the discomfort didn't bother her. She seemed enthralled by every barn, silo, and irrigation ditch. She asked about the age of various farmhouses, the local climate changes, and how farmers coped with unpredictable markets. While they were walking along a fence line that separated Walter's property from a neighboring tract, Eleanor decided it was time. Heart pounding, she admitted that she was connected to Caldwell Motors. Walter's face hardened briefly. She explained that her father started the company decades ago, originally building dependable trucks for working-class Americans. Over time, it had morphed into a luxury brand, leaving a huge demographic behind. She was trying to salvage what she believed was her father's true legacy, designing vehicles that ordinary people could rely on for years, just like Walter relied on his old pickup. Walter listened, leaning against the fence post. She could see in his eyes the flicker of pride and also suspicion. "So, you're one of them corporate folks," he said quietly. "But you want to make an old-school farm truck." Eleanor nodded. "Precisely. I think we need to go back to building vehicles people can fix themselves, make them last for generations. But the board is skeptical. That's why I'm here trying to gather real stories, real data." A long silence settled between them, the cicadas buzzing in the tall grass. Finally, Walter broke the hush. "You could have told me sooner," he said, not unkindly, "but I get it. Sometimes folks like me don't take kindly to big business. Maybe you were afraid I'd slam the door on you." Eleanor bit her lip. "I'm sorry if I misled you. I just didn't know how to explain without sounding like a phony." They started walking again. Walter's boots crunched on the gravel, Eleanor's flats kicking up dust. "You said your father might have passed through here before." "My dad used to talk about a traveling car guy, but I never thought that story was anything special." Walter mused. He paused, glancing back at the horizon. "Look, if this is about building a better truck, I'm all for it, but I don't know if some fancy corporate board is going to listen to old-timers like me." Eleanor let out a breath she'd been holding. "I think you'd be surprised," she whispered. After the truth came out, a subtle shift occurred in their dynamic. Walter grew guarded, worried that perhaps he'd opened up too much to a woman who might only be around until her sedan was fixed. Eleanor felt this tension and worried she'd ruined whatever fragile trust they'd built. She didn't want him to think she saw him as a project. In reality, she was desperate for genuine insights, and she also found herself drawn to the solace in Walter's presence. That afternoon, they stopped at the orchard on Walter's property. While he checked a leaky irrigation spigot, Eleanor walked among the apple trees, taking photos and jotting notes. The scent of ripening fruit hung in the air, and the sun filtered through the branches, creating dappled patterns on the ground. She called out to Walter, "This orchard is beautiful. How many years have these trees been here?" He paused, looking at the gnarled trunks. "My grandfather planted them." "So, about 65, maybe 70 years old. We've had good harvests some years. Other years, not so much." Eleanor crouched to examine the trickle of water escaping a cracked plastic pipe. "Do you fix everything on your own?" He nodded. "I have to. Hiring outside help is expensive, and no one around here is rolling in money." He scraped rust from a connection, seemingly lost in thought. Eventually, he murmured, we used to be a bigger operation when my wife was alive. She'd help manage the business side while I handled the labor. I've been scraping by alone since she passed. My son, Adam, is off in California with a fancy corporate job. Ironically enough, hearing that detail, Eleanor felt a pang of empathy. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. Meaning it, Walter's face softened. Marjorie was something special. Kept me grounded. He stood up, wiping sweat from his brow. But life goes on, I suppose. They walked back through the orchard, and Eleanor quietly compared how different their worlds were, her high-rise office, black sedans, and board meetings versus his orchard, old barns, and solitary mornings. Despite it all, she sensed a shared loneliness in him that mirrored her own. She'd never married, never found anyone who seemed to want more than her family name or the Caldwell fortune. When they returned to the truck, Walter leaned against the hood, crossing his arms. So did Aunt Miss Caldwell. If you're trying to prove to your company that folks like me need a different kind of vehicle, how can I help? Eleanor hesitated, unsure if he was sarcastic or sincere. But his tone carried genuine curiosity. I'd love to pick your brain about what features you wished your old granite truck had, or how maintenance could be easier. Real input that marketing surveys don't capture. Walter shrugged, fiddling with the collar of his flannel shirt. All right, I'll tell you everything, but no corporate spin. Okay, she smiled, relieved. No spin, just the truth. I promise. For the rest of the day, they rode around in the squeaking old pickup, talking about torque, towing capacity, axle ratios, and parts availability at small-town hardware stores. It was the most animated conversation Walter had had in years. And for Eleanor, every single one of his insights felt like a golden key to unlock a part of Caldwell Motors she feared was lost. By evening, they were both surprised to find they'd spent nearly 8 hours together. Time had slipped by like an autumn breeze. Their rapport deepened the next day. When Gus announced that Eleanor's sedan would be ready by noon, Walter found himself strangely unsettled. He told himself it was because he enjoyed being useful, that it had nothing to do with the sudden emptiness he felt imagining her leaving Maplefield. Yet he couldn't deny the spark of connection that had formed, one that had little to do with trucks and everything to do with shared vulnerabilities. Around mid-morning, Eleanor discovered a yellowed letter tucked inside her father's old file. It described an encounter in the Maplefield region with a Joseph Grayson. The date was 1972. Her heart pounded as she read her father's words, praising Joseph's philosophy about vehicles as almost like family members. In the letter, Warren Caldwell vowed to champion more practical designs that regular farmers could maintain on their own. But the rest of corporate leadership wanted to shift to the more profitable luxury lines. Over time, that ambition overshadowed Warren's rural-friendly vision, and Joseph Grayson Walter's father faded into history, uncredited but never forgotten by Warren. Eleanor practically sprinted to Walter's farm. She found him in the barn, polishing an old pitchfork in a moment of quiet dignity. Out of breath, she held the letter out. Walter, this is your father. Joseph, right? My father wrote about him. Walter took the paper gingerly, his eyes scanning the cursive. The mention of Joseph's name, the references to farmland, the date, everything aligned. His eyes grew misty, though he fought to hide it. Dad used to mention a traveling car man named Warren. I guess that was your father. He paused, swallowing. I remember him saying that conversation made him think about how trucks needed to be built to last decades, not just a few years. They ended up in Walter Swaz's small living room. The sun poured through the window as they sipped cold lemonade. On the coffee table lay both fathers' letters, side by side, bridging nearly half a century. The orchard outside rustled in the wind, as if to acknowledge this long overdue reunion of two families' ideals. Walter closed his eyes briefly, remembering his father's stories. He always said if car companies listened to farmers more, we'd have better vehicles. Guess your father listened. Shame the others didn't, Eleanor confided in a low, emotional tone. After he died, the board took Caldwell Motors in a direction that valued style over substance. I want to change that. Walter, I want to bring back what my father and your father discussed all those years ago, a durable truck for everyday folks. Walter leaned back against the worn couch cushion, exhaling slowly. I'll help you if that's what you want. I'll show you exactly what's needed out here. But I'm just an old farmer with a failings orchard. She shook her head. That's exactly what makes you perfect. You understand what's real. Hesitation lingered a moment. Listen, there's a corporate side to all this. My mother and siblings are on the board. They're not easily swayed. But if I can show them real data, real testimonies, maybe I can push the Heritage series, the name I've been calling it internally, into production. Walter nodded. Heritage series. That's got a nice ring to it. He glanced out the window at the orchard, where the branches swayed. Suddenly, the memory of his overdue bills pressed on his mind. Could this project also be a way to save his farm from foreclosure? If you're offering me a role, I might just take it. Eleanor, he said quietly, I can't do this alone, and maybe it'll bring new life to this old land. Eleanor's sedan was finally fixed that afternoon. Gus waved her off with a grin as she pulled out of the garage. But instead of heading straight to the highway, she drove to Walter's farm one last time. She found him sitting on his porch, a small radio playing an old country tune. The battered pickup was parked to the side, as if it too waited to hear her decision. Taking a deep breath, she parked the sedan and stepped onto the porch. I'm supposed to leave tomorrow morning, Eleanor admitted, her voice laced with unease. But if you don't mind, I'd like to extend my stay a bit. Just a few more days, maybe collect more of your insights? Walter responded with a measured nod. I think that'd be fine. Wouldn't want all this farmland knowledge to go to waste. Would we? They shared a faint laugh, an unspoken understanding that something more than business was at play. The next few days brought them even closer. They rose early to walk the fields, Walter showing her every nook and cranny. She jotted notes on adjustable bed sizes for hauling livestock feed, undercarriage protection against gravel roads, and a simplified dashboard that didn't distract from driving. Sometimes they spoke of deeply personal matters. Walter's recollections of helping his father fix the truck's engine, or of Marjorie canning peaches in the summer kitchen. Eleanor spoke of her father's final months, how she regretted not spending more time with him when work demanded her presence. Occasionally, she caught Walter's gaze drifting to her face, as though he was trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the corporate heiress she claimed to be. On the third evening, a summer storm rolled in, lightning streaked the sky, and thunder shook the farmhouse windows. The power flickered out, leaving them in darkness save for a kerosene lamp Walter retrieved from the cellar. They settled in the living room, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Rain pounded on the roof, and the wind whistled through the old gaps in the house's frame. Over the howling storm, Eleanor said softly, "Thank you for not pushing me away. I know this is unusual. My being here." Walter looked at her face illuminated by the flickering glow. "Life's short, Miss Caldwell. Too short for me to be turning away kindness or new opportunities." Something about the intimacy of that darkened farmhouse, the rawness of the storm outside, emboldened them to talk it as they never had before. Eleanor confessed her loneliness in a corporate world where everyone seemed to want either her money or a piece of Caldwell Motors. Walter nodded, saying he understood loneliness too. His was the kind that grew each year after Marjorie's death. They spent hours in that glow, trading stories of their families, their regrets, their hopes. At some point, the conversation drifted to the orchard's future. Eleanor suggested that if they moved forward with the Heritage series, Caldwell Motors could sponsor a new irrigation system for the orchard as part of a pilot project. Walter hesitated, pride flaring. "I don't want charity," he said. Eleanor responded gently. "It wouldn't be charity, more like a test site for the new truck's capabilities in hauling and distributing irrigation materials." After a moment, Walter nodded. The line between business and personal favor blurred, but not in an uncomfortable way. The lamp sputtered, and outside the storm raged. But inside that small circle of light, they found a flicker of mutual hope. When the storm passed, the sun rose on glistening fields. Muddy puddles reflected the early light, and the orchard leaves shimmered with droplets. Eleanor stirred early, stepping out onto the porch to watch the morning transform the wet farmland into something almost magical. Walter soon joined her, a steaming mug of coffee in each hand. They sipped in companionable silence, lulled by the drip of water off the roof. By mid-morning, the roads had dried enough for them to venture into town. Eleanor insisted they stop at the county clerk's office, where she wanted to research farmland ownership records. She was searching for any mention of Caldwell Motors or potential land deals from decades past. Walter grinned at how determined she looked, striding into the old building like a general marching into war. A middle-aged clerk eyed them suspiciously at first, but with some gentle persuasion, she allowed Eleanor to sift through old files. Walter helped, scanning for any mention of Joseph Grayson, Warren Caldwell, or references to experimental trucks. Their efforts bore fruit. A dusty ledger from 1972 contained a permit for a vehicle demonstration on private farmland, courtesy of Joseph Grayson. The name Caldwell was nowhere on the document, but the timeline matched perfectly. Eleanor snapped photos of the pages with her phone. "This is exactly the kind of historical link I need," she said, nearly bouncing with excitement. Walter suppressed a small laugh, finding her zeal oddly endearing. Later, they visited Maplefield's tiny library. Eleanor hoped to see old newspapers that might mention Caldwell Motors. While waiting, they sat on a bench by the large windows overlooking Maplefield's only main street. Walter turned to her and asked quietly, "What's your plan when you go back? How are you going to convince those folks on your board?" She gazed at the passing cars outside, mostly older models, battered but still chugging along. "Data," she replied. "Stories. Evidence that real farmers need real trucks. And maybe if I can get you to come with me to present your perspective, it'll carry more weight." Walter inhaled slowly, that old war of pride and uncertainty gnawing at him. "I don't know anything about boardrooms, suits, or fancy talk. I'm just a farmer trying not to drown in debt." She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "That's precisely why you'll make an impact. You're genuine." The quiet warmth in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice, he found himself nodding in spite of himself. By dusk, they returned to the farm, arms loaded with apes of old newspaper clippings. Walter invited Eleanor to stay for dinner. He had some leftover stew. Simple but hearty. She accepted gladly. In the dimly lit kitchen, they ate at the small table. The hush of the farmland outside enveloped them. Halfway through the meal, Eleanor surprised him by reaching across the table to lightly touch his wrist. "Walter, I realize we hardly know each other in some ways, but I feel like we have a deep connection in others. Thank you for trusting me, for letting me in." Walter swallowed, a warmth spreading through his chest that was equal parts gratitude and fear. He'd lived alone for so long, shutting out the possibility of connection or heartbreak. Yet here was this remarkable woman, bridging two worlds with nothing but sincerity. He cleared his throat, heart pounding. "I appreciate you being here, Eleanor. It's been a long time since I've felt not alone." There it was, stripped of bravado. A truth that shimmered in the space between them, as tangible as the battered walls of that little kitchen. A few days later, Eleanor had to leave Maplefield, at least temporarily. Caldwell Motors Executive Council was meeting soon, and she needed to prepare a formal presentation on the Heritage Series concept. Walter helped her load the trunk of her sedan with boxes of notes and the orchard's fresh apples as a gift for her siblings, though she joked they probably wouldn't appreciate produce as much as a financial statement. Despite the playful remark, her eyes brimmed with regret at the thought of leaving. Walter stood by the farmhouse steps, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Will you come back?" he asked quietly, a vulnerability creeping into his voice. Eleanor stepped closer, brushing dust off his shoulder. "Yes," she said firmly. "And if things go well in the city, maybe we can formalize the orchard as the pilot site for the new line of trucks." She paused, uncertain whether to add the deeper thought tugging at her heart. Eventually, she only managed, "Take care of yourself." "All right," he nodded, tipping his cap in that old-fashioned way. The moment felt strangely like a painful farewell. Their gazes locked, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Then, without warning, she leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, letting her lips linger for a fleeting second. Walter's breath caught, his eyes briefly closing. Before he could respond, she pulled away with a small, wistful smile and climbed into the sedan, driving down the gravel path until she was out of sight. Over the next couple of weeks, Maplefield seemed emptier to Walter. He tended the orchard and fiddled with the irrigation repairs, but his thoughts drifted frequently to Eleanor. Sometimes he half expected her to step out of the barn, notebook in hand. At night, he reread the letter his father wrote, the one that mentioned the traveling salesman named Warren. It struck him that the original seeds of Caldwell Motors' early success might have been planted right here on this land. Meanwhile, Eleanor flew back to Caldwell Motors headquarters, a towering skyscraper in a bustling East Coast metropolis. She donned her usual professional attire, a crisp blazer, understated pearl earrings, and a steeled expression. Yet inside, she felt nervous. She had to persuade a room full of executives, including her elder brother, Julian Caldwell, and her steely mother, Mary Caldwell, who chaired the board. They had long questioned her soft approach, especially since the luxury lines were so profitable. The notion of building trucks for the common man felt to them like a step backward. In the executive lounge, she prepared slides, data charts, and photos of Maplefield's farmland. She added the historical tie-in, how Warren Caldwell's earliest inspiration came from that region. Her concluding pitch was that Caldwell Motors, facing changing markets and corporate social pressure, should reintroduce a robust, down-to-earth model. Perhaps it could fill a gap in the market and restore the brand's authenticity. She even typed out quotes from Walter, anonymizing him as an experienced local farmer. The night before her presentation, she paced her penthouse apartment, wishing Walter was there with her, offering that calm stability she'd grown to cherish. At dawn, the day of the pitch, she stood in front of 12 board members who eyed her with detached interest. Julian sipped his coffee. Her mother's gaze was unwavering. Eleanor's heart pounded as she launched into the story. She showed them old newspaper clippings, read excerpts from Warren Caldwell's letter referencing Joseph Grayson. Slide by slide, she laid out Maplefield's example. When she finally finished, the room was silent. One board member coughed. Julian drummed his fingers on the table. Then her mother spoke. Eleanor, Mary Caldwell said, "Voice cool. This is an ambitious idea, but is there real evidence that we can profit from such a philanthropic product line?" Eleanor took a steadying breath. It's not philanthropy, Dawn. Mother, it's tapping into a market segment that's been abandoned, rural Americans who want vehicles that endure for decades. Yes, the margins might be smaller at first, but loyalty and brand integrity can last a lifetime. She pulled up cost projections, carefully explaining how production modifications wouldn't be as prohibitive as the board feared. A few members leaned in, interest peaked. Julian Caldwell, her older brother, glanced at the spreadsheets. We have no current distribution channels in these areas. Ellie, and no brand recognition in the farmland segment. Caldwell Motors is known for high-end sedans and SUVs. We'd be starting from scratch. Eleanor squared her shoulders. Perhaps that's exactly why we should do it. Diversify, rebuild trust. I've already identified a test farm, Maplefield's orchard. We'd develop the prototype, run real-world trials, and use that data to refine the final design. The room buzzed with hushed conversation. Mary Caldwell's nails tapped the table. You've done your homework, she acknowledged. But I'm not entirely convinced. We need an influential brand ambassador from that demographic, someone who can speak to actual rural needs. Otherwise, it's just a sales pitch from us city folk. Eleanor hesitated, a thought swirling in her mind. She pictured Walloon, standing resolute against a golden field, speaking in his quiet, genuine tone. Could she persuade him to come to a corporate meeting, share his perspective? She realized that might be precisely the sort of authenticity they needed. I can bring someone, she said finally, someone whose family has farmed for generations. He's been my greatest source of insight. A murmur spread around the table. One of the board members asked, Are we talking about an agricultural consultant or something? A farmer, she clarified. He's exactly who my father once consulted, or at least his father was. The family story is strongly linked to Caldwell Motors' earliest roots. Seeing the mixture of skepticism and interest, Eleanor pressed on. Give me a month. I'll bring him here to do a short presentation and answer your questions. If, after that, you still think it's a lost cause, I'll drop the proposal. Mary Caldwell watched her daughter intently. You have 1 month, she pronounced, ignoring Julian's subtle protest. And Eleanor, if this meeting doesn't go well, I expect you to refocus on more profitable lines. Eleanor nodded, forcing herself to remain calm. Inside, adrenaline surged. She had a chance, albeit slim, to push through the Heritage series. But it hinged on convincing Walter Grayson to leave his beloved orchard and speak in a cold, corporate boardroom. It was like dragging a mountain lion into a city cage. After the meeting, Julian caught up with her in the hallway. What's gotten into you, Ellie? We're a luxury brand. Trucks for farmers. It's madness. She bristled. Sometimes madness is what a stale company needs. And you know as well as I do how Dad felt about real, salt-of-the-earth Americans. Julian shrugged. Dad's not here to keep you from chasing fantasies. Don't lose your head. She offered him a tight smile, dismissing him with a glance. She knew it was risky, but risking nothing meant the Caldwell name would drift further from the ideals Warren held dear. If that meant stepping on Julian's toes or incurring her mother's disapproval, so be it. That evening, she booked a flight back to Maplefield. The moment she hit confirm purchase, an odd combination of relief and anxiety washed over her. She realized she was almost more nervous about seeing Walter again than she'd been about the board meeting. Would he even agree to come to the city? Did he feel the same undercurrent she felt? A swirl of possibilities kept her awake late into the night, staring at the city lights through her apartment window and missing the quiet darkness of the farmhouse. 4 days later, Eleanor stepped off a small commuter plane onto the modest tarmac of Maplefield's regional airport. The air smelled fresh with a hint of hay and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the city's sharp metallic tang. She found a rental car practical, small, and drove straight for Walter's farm. Along the way, her nerves jittered. Would Walter resent her abrupt departure? Or would he understand she had to fight her battle in the corporate arena? Pulling into his driveway, she saw the orchard in partial bloom, having missed some earlier season's fruit cycles but catching the beginnings of a late summer harvest. The battered pickup was parked near the barn. Walter emerged from behind the orchard rows, wearing a weathered hat and carrying a wooden crate of apples. His expression shifted from mild surprise to cautious warmth. Setting the crate down, he approached as she got out of the car. "Welcome back," he said quietly. Removing his hat, she nodded, trying to gauge his mood from the lines around his eyes. "Mind if I put my bag inside?" she ventured. He gave a silent nod, then motioned toward the house. Once they were in the living room, she told him everything. How the board was partially intrigued but demanded a rural ambassador. How she'd mentioned him specifically, and how Mary Caldwell herself insisted on meeting him within a month. Walter perched on the edge of the couch, arms resting on his knees. "So you're saying you want me, a small-town farmer who's barely making ends meet, to talk to a bunch of executives in suits in your fancy headquarters?" "Yes," she admitted, inhaling to steady herself. "I know it's a lot to ask. You'd have to leave your farm for a few days. At least, I can pay you a consultant's fee substantial enough to maybe help you out with those orchard repairs or the irrigation system, but I don't want you to feel like I'm using you." She trailed off, realizing how precarious this was. Walter stared at the floorboards for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he rose and walked to the dusty mantel where pictures of his family stood. He lifted a small framed photo of Joseph Grayson. "My father believed in your father," he murmured. He was proud that someone with that big a name cared about real folks. Slowly, he turned to face Eleanor. "I'll do it, not because of the money, though heaven knows I could use it. I'll do it because I hate to see a good idea fizzle out, especially one that might save guys like me." Relief flooded Eleanor, and tears pricked her eyes. She nearly flung her arms around him, but she held back, uncertain if that would be too forward. Instead, she simply thanked him, voice trembling with gratitude. Walter only nodded, but the tension in his shoulders eased. For the next week, they prepared. Eleanor taught him about corporate jargon, impossible questions the board might lob. Walter showed her the orchard's newest set of repairs, culminating in a thorough list of improvements a truly farmer-friendly truck would need. In their spare moments, they rode around Maplefield, visiting Gus's garage, talking with other farmers, gathering testimonials. One evening, after a long day of note-taking, they found themselves sipping sweet tea in the barn. The setting sun cast a mellow glow on their faces, and Walter spoke quietly. "No matter what happens, I want you to know having you around these past weeks made me realize I'm not done living. And I'm not just talking about the orchard." He slipped a shy, almost boyish smile. Eleanor felt her heart swell. She gently touched his arm, sending a current of warmth that had nothing to do with orchard expansions or corporate deals. Their journey to the Caldwell Motors headquarters was a stark contrast to Walter's everyday life. Eleanor had purchased 2 plane tickets and arranged a modest hotel suite near the corporate district. Walter, wearing the only sports jacket he owned and a neatly ironed shirt, looked uncomfortable from the moment they stepped off the escalator into the gleaming marble lobby. Glass walls soared overhead, and well-dressed employees moved in a brisk current. On the day of the big meeting, Eleanor led Walter to the executive conference room on the 30th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline, so different from Maplefield's rolling fields. The board members filed in, wearing tailored suits, expensive watches, and guarded expressions. Mary Caldwell, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, sat at the head of the table. Julian Caldwell, leaning back with an air of skepticism, occupied her right. Eleanor spoke first, summarizing the concept of the Heritage series. Then she introduced Walter as the real heart of the project, the living proof that dependable trucks still mattered to farmers. Walter cleared his throat, shifting his weight. He recounted how Joseph Grayson had once met Warren Caldwell, explaining that the orchard and farmland always prized vehicles that could last decades. His voice shook at first, but as he got going, sincerity took over. He described real challenges, high repair costs, limited dealer networks, the frustration of complicated electronics. He spoke of an aging demographic in rural towns, many of whom wanted to keep driving well into their senior years without fumbling through advanced technology. When Walter finished, silence lingered. Mary Caldwell tapped a pen on a notepad. "Mr. Grayson," she said, "I appreciate your first-hand account, but Caldwell Motors is a global brand with investors to please. Why should we redirect resources from profitable lines to gamble on the Heritage series?" Walter pressed his lips together. "Ma'am, I know about risk. Every season, I put seeds in the ground hoping the weather cooperates. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But the day we stop trying to grow something new is the day we give up on the future." He paused, glancing around. "I can't guarantee success, but I can guarantee that if we never build a truck for the thousands of farmers like me, we'll never know what we might have accomplished." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Then Julian chimed in. "You talk about thousands of farmers, but that's a fraction of our usual target demographic." Walter met his gaze, unflinching. "I may not know corporate math, but what if you're missing a demographic that's never even considered Caldwell because you're not building anything relevant to them? You gain loyalty by proving you care about real problems, not just the shiniest new tech." Eleanor's chest tightened as she watched her mother's expression. Mary Caldwell finally spoke. "This is compelling," she admitted, "but we need to see if it's financially viable. We'll run more feasibility studies. Meanwhile, the board will vote on whether to allocate a preliminary budget for your prototype. If it passes, we'll revisit in 6 months with an updated outlook." Agreed, Eleanor nodded. Walter exhaled. The board dispersed for an internal discussion, leaving Eleanor and Walter alone in the corridor. He looked spent, as if he'd just run a marathon. Eleanor grabbed his hand. "You did great," she whispered, her eyes shining. He gave a tired smile. "I'd rather wrangle an angry bull than face that again." But beneath the fatigue, he felt a quiet pride. 3 days later, the board finally rendered its preliminary decision. Caldwell Motors would fund the first phase of the Heritage Series. It wasn't a resounding endorsement, but it was enough to move forward with design and early production plans, with Maplefield's orchard officially recognized as the pilot site. Eleanor and Walter stood in Mary Caldwell's office, a space filled with modern art and floor-to-ceiling windows. Mary offered a measured nod. "Congratulations, Eleanor and Mr. Grayson. We'll see if this initiative blossoms into something the brand can proudly stand behind." Walter felt an unaccustomed relief, part validation, part disbelief. As they left the building, Eleanor turned to him, tears glistening in her eyes. "You did it, Walter. We did it." He drew her into a gentle hug, ignoring the curious glances from passing employees. "I guess we're partners now," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. In more ways than one, I hope. They returned to Maplefield soon after, greeted by the orchard's greenery and a sense of calm. Over the ensuing months, a small Caldwell Motors team arrived, setting up a makeshift design and testing station on part of Walter's land. They brought a prototype, a truck labeled Heritage Alpha, which was boxier than current Caldwell models, equipped with an easily accessible engine bay and sturdy materials. Every week, Walter and the team took it for test drives along the rough gravel roads, hauling apples, hay, and feed. They recorded data on fuel economy, suspension stress, and mechanical wear. Late one evening, after all the corporate engineers had gone back to their hotels, Walter and Eleanor lingered in the barn. The Heritage Alpha sat nearby, dusted with dirt and speckled by orchard leaves. They marveled at how it symbolized both a bridging of old and new. "My father would have been proud of this," Eleanor whispered, running her fingers along the truck's hood. Walter nodded. "Mine too." Outside, a crisp fall wind rustled the apple tree branches. The horizon glowed with the last embers of sunset. Eleanor turned to Walter. "You've given me more than just insight into how to build a durable truck. You've reminded me what it means to genuinely care about people, land, and promises we make to ourselves." She paused, her voice trembling a bit. "I'm not leaving this time, not permanently. I might have to travel, but Maplefield feels more like home than anywhere else I've been." Walter's heart pounded at her words. He had once believed his life would end quietly in the orchard, overshadowed by debt and solitude. Now the orchard was on the path to revival. His farmland was receiving a much-needed injection of resources, and something new blossomed in his heart every time he looked at Eleanor. A few weeks later, in a quiet moment under the orchard's largest apple tree, Walter pulled out a small velvet box. It contained a simple gold band set with a modest diamond originally belonging to his mother. He debated for days whether it was too soon, whether he was too old to start again. But the gentle radiance in Eleanor's smile told him life was indeed short, and second chances were precious. Kneeling on one knee, he held the ring up. "Eleanor Caldwell, will you?" His voice broke, tears gathering in his eyes. She laughed softly, tears of her own brimming, and answered before he could finish. "Yes, Walter, of course yes." They sealed it with a tender kiss, tears mixing with soft laughter. Far off, the orchard leaves rustled in the breeze, as if applauding this union of two souls who had found each other through a broken-down car and a half-century-old conversation between their fathers. The next day, Maplefield awakened to the sight of Walter driving the Heritage Alpha, with Eleanor by his side, heading into town for a celebratory meal. Old-timers peered out from storefronts, some tipping their hats at the couple whose remarkable story had already become local lore. And though they spoke quietly, most everyone in Maplefield knew that an unlikely partnership had formed between a big city heiress and a small-town farmer, a partnership rooted in orchard soil, a father's legacy, and a love that promised to last as long as the strongest farm truck. Looking back, it's hard not to marvel at how a small act of generosity opened the door to a lifetime of possibility. Through the characters' trials, financial woes on the farm, boardroom showdowns in the city, and doubts that tested their hearts, they forged a bond no one could have anticipated. The orchard, once in decline, now flourishes with renewed hope, and the company, rooted in a vision for practical vehicles, stands ready to serve those who need it most. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that real connection often sprouts in the unlikeliest of places, if we're brave enough to see it through. Thank you for sharing in this journey, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most? What do you wish you could have seen more of? Leave a comment below. Let's keep the conversation going and inspire each other along the way.